Hi, I'm Mimi Chan. Welcome to Culture Chat. Thanks for joining the conversation. In this episode, I discuss a sensitive and personal subject, my experience with childhood sexual abuse. While this may not be a comfortable subject for a lot of people, I feel that it is an important one. And as always, anything that makes us uncomfortable is probably good for us. I have referenced being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse a few times on this show and discussed it in a previous episode dedicated to reading my original blog post. I thought it would be a meaningful discussion to have with my husband, Oscar, who is my partner in life and my support system. Even after all of these years, talking about it is difficult and I often get choked up during the interview. Please be patient with this one, as it was not an easy conversation for me. We also discuss our opinions on why survivors are not believed and what each of us can do to improve this societal issue. Also, Oscar and I are not doctors or therapists. This episode and blog post are for informational purposes only, and nothing is intended as professional or medical advice in any way. The episode is also not recommended for children. I'm grateful for these conversations and hope you find value in them. If you are, please rate my podcast on your platform of choice. It would also be very meaningful if you supported with a donation to help keep this podcast going by donating to patreon.com/sifumimichan or on my website. For comments or suggestions, email me at mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or reach out on social media at sifumimichan. Now on with the show. Hello, Oscar. Thanks for joining me on Culture Chat again.
I like the again.
Oh,
that was good.
That's approved?
That's approved.
Well, I always appreciate the time you take out of your very busy day to come in and talk to me.
Yeah, I mean, we clear the schedule. We clear the schedule by you saying, Oscar, talk to me on Culture Chat. And I'm like, all right, let's do it.
Well, it's been interesting as we've had some great listener feedback about our episodes. They love us talking about Kung Fu and going on our rants and a little bit of politics. And so, you mentioned the other day you're listening to some podcasts, and it kind of resonated with me that I think it's time to remind people and kind of discuss again some of the experiences that I've had and kind of what's led me to be who I am today. A lot of our listeners have been listening now over the last COVID-19 time period and heard me reference a few times when I speak with Greg Rucka on the Mimi and Greg show on Fridays. And I often talk about my inability to read certain literature, watch certain movies that have really strong sexual abuse themes or anything with rape in it. And so I just thought I would talk a little bit about my survivor experience and kind of how prevalent it is, especially for childhood abuse.
Yeah, I think from things that I've heard and listened to, it is a lot more prevalent than you would think on the on the outskirts of your mind, right? But the more you dig deeper, then you realize that it's unfortunately a lot more prevalent.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did was when I originally decided to come forward and share publicly was in like 2018, I think. I was, pretty much not that long ago, if you think about it. And is, an experience that happened to me when I was a child. And I did some research. And I think what I'll do is I'll just start off with some of these facts because they're kind of jarring, but I feel like it kind of gives people a reference of how often this occurs. So this is also 2009 and 2000 stats. And so I'm sure in the last 10 plus years or more, there's been updates and things that are even more current, but it just really gives you an idea of the landscape of what this subject entails and how very, very prevalent it is, but not as talked about. And I always find that on this show, this is a good time to talk about things that people are uncomfortable with and often don't want to discuss or hear, but that it is a learning opportunity. So the first statistic that really made me cringe was approximately 20% of girls, 1 in 5, and 8% of boys, 1 in 12 and a half, will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. And 95% of sexually abused children will be abused by someone they know and trust. I'm going to stop there because those first two absolutely already apply to me. And for me, I will just share briefly with our listeners who don't know because they've started listening after 2018 or really haven't heard a lot about my story, is that basically a couple years ago, I decided to share this blog post that kind of revealed something that happened to me when I want to say I was maybe between the ages of 9 to 12. And immediately I already feel people judging me by saying, "Oh, you don't remember exactly how old you were." And I'll say, "When was your last car accident? Exactly how old are you? And what were you wearing?" But in essence, yeah, it's not something I literally wrote down and documented so I would have. But basically, when I was between 9 and 12, my first cousin, who was over 4 years older than me, sexually abused me. And it was kind of brought out by the Supreme Court Kavanaugh hearings and how angry I got about the rehashing of Anita Hill and what was happening during those Kavanaugh hearings. And that kind of just prompted me to go, you know what? People are saying, why would she say something X amount of years later? How can we believe her? And I just thought to myself, well, I know that I'm credible. I know who I am and I know how people view me. And so I thought that it was a timely moment to kind of share.
I I like the analogy, even though it's not not the same as being in a car accident. But there's trauma. I guess trauma is the equal factor. But I've been in multiple car accidents. I can't tell you the year actually. The car accident that I was in, that you know about, where you came and like helped me. Like I don't remember the year or the.
Our listeners are going, "What? You must be a bad driver. You've been in multiple car accidents."
Okay, I haven't been in a ton of car accidents, but I don't remember the year and the date of the month or exactly how old I was when I was in my car accident, right? Where I wrecked the front of my car. So I like that analogy. And
Well,
we
but nobody would ever also say to you then, "I don't believe you. You didn't get in a car accident," because you don't exactly know how old you were and what month it was. And
well, the unfortunately in a lot of these cases, the trauma in a car accident can be very physical, like the physical scarring, the car actually has gotten damaged. Unfortunately, in some cases, or maybe in many cases, obviously I don't know what the statistics are, but the sexual trauma is not going to be remaining physically. Like there's no physical evidence sometimes. I don't even want to talk about when there is, but and so then it's all mental, right? Which is so you can't see it. So I guess it's easier for people to go down that route, which is I don't know. I guess this is ridiculous.
yeah, I think what strikes me as insane is exactly that. That no one would say, "Well, I don't believe you. You didn't get into a car accident." And I keep using this analogy because I feel like it allows people to understand, not that I'm saying car accidents are like sexual abuse. I'm saying that memory and trauma can definitively alter time, right? But it doesn't mean the experience didn't happen. So I think that it's interesting how quick people are to judge and say that something didn't happen to someone. And granted, there are people out there that maybe cry wolf and don't have something happen, or maybe they just want money out of a famous person, or I don't know, right? But I do know that it doesn't usually benefit the survivor to share their experience for any ulterior motive.
I agree. From my experience looking at it from the outside, it's not pleasant. I don't see like and this came out again around that time from the Kavanaugh hearings. What possible benefit was that lady getting from her allegations towards Kavanaugh? None. Like
Yeah, she was
there.
getting death threats. She
Well,
was getting
I'm sorry.
harassed
I
by
guess there.
media. I mean, she was trying to bring light to something, or someone was going to be somewhere like the Supreme Court. But the thing is, it it's more like the detriment for her was immense, and people just don't see that.
Right. It's not all on the positive. I'm sure, and this is again something that's personal to everyone is who has gone through this, is your trauma that you went through and your process of healing is very individualized. The way that you would go through it can't be equal to the way another person goes through it. In the same way that if you and I were in World War I in the foxhole, in the trenches,
Mm-hmm.
one of us would come out and be like, "Yep, war, it was rough, it was fine," and the other one would just be suffering from being what they called shell shock, but it's now known as like post traumatic stress disorder and all these other things. So
Mm-hmm.
the way that we all deal with things is different. So I think it's important to recognize that first we shouldn't be judging. However, a survivor decides to come out, how their process for healing goes, we should give them a little bit of room to do that. I don't know. I mean, you've gone through it, so you tell me. But and then the other thing is, as someone who is um, married or close or to someone who has gone through that, I can say that it's important from that person's side to just say that one, it's a shame that it's something that should never have happened, right? Like there's no way that what happened was right, and it's just it just should not have happened, and it's a it was a bad thing, and then let that person process it, right? And know that you're there, but maybe you don't need someone to be there for you right then and there, right? Maybe your process is you just needed to let some put it out there. I mean, I don't know. You tell me what.
Well, before we go on as well, I want to we keep saying that woman. Her name was Christine Blasey Ford, and
Yeah,
just so she isn't just like kind of chalked up to not having her exact name right. I knew there was a middle name. I didn't want to get it wrong. So obviously, she experienced just horrors for coming forth, and then that brought about the rehashing of the Anita Hill feelings. And so when I decided to kind of go through that, it's like I realized, like, through my life, there are things that define who I am. And one of them is being a teacher. And so for me, once I felt strong enough and relatively healed for the day anyway, because it's a process, relatively healed for the day, it makes you think about teachable moments. And I realized that maybe if I shared my experience, other parents would then make a choice to have a discussion with their kids from a really, really young age on what is appropriate for, body awareness, what is appropriate for other people to touch you, be what is appropriate in terms of sexual education for a 2-year-old. Like there is appropriate ways to educate a toddler. There actually are. I'm not an educator in that field, but I know there are. And I think that because of my culture, because of my era that I grew up in, I'm in my 40s. Everybody knows it because of 45th Foo. There's a lot of taboo and stigma around having these discussions, and you wait till you're in eighth grade before you get a sex ed video in eighth grade for like 20 minutes, and basically they show you like how an egg is fertilized and blah blah blah, and then they show you a childbirth, and then that's it. But by eighth grade, that's just way too late, especially if you're looking at the next stat, which is of these molesting a child under 6, 50% were family members, and family members count for 23% of those abusing children 12 to 17. The most vulnerable age for children to be exposed to sexual assault is between 3 and 8 years, with the majority of onset happening between these ages. So if we wait till middle school, which is, I want to say what, 13, 11 to 13 or something like that.
I don't know what.
That's
First,
obvious.
I
That's
need to know what middle
obviously
school is
that's
first.
that's obviously too late, is what I'm saying. So, I mean, basically, based on those stats that I just read there, if you're looking at 3 to 8 years old being the most vulnerable age, and then a huge percentage being that, under 18, that 20% of girls and 8% of boys. I mean, that already is showing you like the statistic of like we teach our children too late. And obviously, you and I are not parents, so we're not judging parents. But based on my experience, I can say that one of the big things was my anger for those hearings that were happening, the fact that survivors are not believed, but also I was at a place where I felt that I was ready to share so that others could learn.
Right. And I think that's a noble cause for it. So what would be the, not to put words in your mouth, but it's I would assume that, hey, if you were to help one family, one parent tell one child, and that's it, that's the full impact, that
Yeah,
all this, then it would be worth it.
That would totally be worth
Yeah.
it.
I agree. Because what you're doing there is, in essence, is saving a life, right? Maybe not from necessarily from death, but from all of the years of having to work through whatever that trauma caused. And then, unfortunately, and I think one of your stats on there have the high incidence of suicide, like 10 to 13 times more likely to commit suicide, right?
Mhm.
People who suffer from sexual trauma. So there is, not that you're like, okay, I'm your savior, right? That's not the way you're approaching it, but you're saving someone from, if you could save someone from that trauma for one, and then whatever that means for years for the rest of that person's life, then you're saving that person's life. And I think it's a very noble cause. And from my side, experiencing it on the outside, it wasn't easy. So kudos to you.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'm a Kung Fu teacher and I'm a very independent woman, as everyone knows, but it's still really hard to talk about.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important, though, to have the conversation, and it's important for people to know that these things happen, and they happen to people who are functioning. Like, I feel like the victim picture and image is that of which, unless you are a kitten missing a leg with one eye,
You're like a
and
broken
you're just
person.
totally broken and you're not functioning, you're less likely to believe. I feel that because I'm functioning and strong and independent, I've had a lot of people who don't believe me.
Yeah. And I'm not qualified to make this into a therapy session, but I can assume that does
I have
not
my own
make
therapist, thank you.
yeah, does not make you feel good. But to draw a parallel from to so many functioning drug addicts, right? There's I'm not going to pull numbers out of my ass, but I remember having discussions with physicians who told me that there's so many people who are on drugs that you would think they're portrayed in movies as these homeless heroin addicts,
Right.
but like,
they're in these houses where,
correct,
like from Breaking Bad, where there's like
yeah,
20 or 30
no
people in
teeth.
there, and they're all like,
And yes, that exists, but there's also highly functioning drug addicts on really hard
on Wall
drugs.
Street.
Yeah, I mean, in
Yeah, but
in a
from the other movies,
professional,
yes.
in white collar or blue
Mhm.
collar, what in those type of environments. And so for that, then I can easily draw a parallel to someone who has suffered sexual abuse or sexual trauma and still being able to function in society. But just because you're functioning in society does not mean that the things that happen weren't impactful. And again, easier for me to say, being your husband, right, and being here while you were going through it, so then I can I can see how it affects you, right, and it would affect someone. But maybe I wouldn't. It wouldn't be so easy for me to see if I didn't know someone so closely, right? Because then it would just be speculation, maybe, or like I would hope that I would have empathy, but maybe I don't know.
I think it depends on where you are in your life, just like so many of the things that we've discussed in the past. And I will tell my listeners that this is, even now, still a very difficult conversation for me to have.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I was it. This is crazy, but for some reason I do not shy away from listening to things that are traumatic like that are dark, right? And even sometimes I listen to some things that just it's almost too dark. I'm like, why am I putting myself through this? And so that's kind of my main experience with it,
Like
right?
any Korean film.
Well, yeah, those damn Korean films are always so dark. No, there was just a couple of actually podcasts recently that I listened to. One was it was called The Greatest Pandemic, and it was a Sam Harris podcast, and it was about child sexual abuse and the work that these great reporters of the New York Times are doing on trying to expose the prevalence of it. And it went down some pretty horrible places. And then very recently, very famous podcaster Tim Ferriss and author, right, Tim Ferriss, came out with his story, and I think what I got out of it is, number one, is very prevalent, and then number two is for the people who have gone through it to realize that they're not alone, that there's resources out there, that they can get through it, um, and and I don't know what else, and that and it just seems like it's just something to me. If we were to prioritize all of the things that are wrong, um, things that happen to children, especially, I guess, when they're innocent, is um, is on the top there for things that horrible things. But I think we need to sometimes expose things that dark to the light. Like those things need to be brought out because otherwise they'll stay in the dark, scurrying.
Yeah,
And
I mean, the Catholic Church is a perfect example of scurrying in the dark and things getting so horrific that it becomes an unbelievable toxic situation for so many, and so many lives ruined. And our listeners are thinking, God, Mimi is really not talking as much this episode. And I will admit, this is a really difficult conversation. And so I need a moment. But I will say that for those that are listening and think they don't know someone, I guarantee you do. You just don't know it. That you
I
know
would
someone
agree with
who's
that.
experienced some sort of sexual abuse or trauma as a child, especially because, and I think it's on here in terms of people who actually admit to it, or 98% of the cases reported show that children's statements are true. And then it's also, I believe, it may not be on this page that I have here, but uh, like the statistic is every 8 minutes, Child Protective Services substantiates or finds evidence for a claim. And that's the ones that are reported, right? And so in just our small circle of family and friends, I was shocked at how many people have a similar experience as I do.
I was as well, and I think one of the things I remember that sparked you wanting to say it was me bringing up a story I heard from my side of the family,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I was shocked. I was like, wow, that's crazy. And the not to take away from as boys who suffer from sexual abuse, because I think the percentage is also very high, but I remember saying, wow, I guess I'm really lucky. I grew up just us four boys, really close in age, and we were more like like quadruplets, right? Because we were only just a year apart
Mm-hmm.
and didn't have like big gaps in age, and we kind of had each other to play games and fight,
Yeah.
fight and play. And so,
And
yeah.
and for our listeners to kind of understand that difference there, when it says, a huge percentage are abused by older, more powerful children. And from what my therapist has shared with me, it's like when you start spanning like 4+ years, but also you have to look at size. Like if there's a child that's like 4 years older, but also extraordinarily large, and you're like a very small, petite, like there's just this visual, mental, so many factors that go into how you see these older children. And I'm really affected by this right now and later in my life than I was, say, when I was in my teens. I didn't really think back as heavily as I do as an adult. And I think this is my speculation, but often why these stories don't come about till later, because you're not really ready to deal with that trauma until you're maybe mature enough, or maybe willing to accept that it's a part of your story and a part of who you are. And or maybe until you've been through a lot of therapy. I don't know which comes first, but I think that what resonates is that a lot of people who come forward are much older and say, oh, this happened 20 or 30 years ago or whatever. And I think if I think about the actual abuse, for our listeners, my personal experience was not in which I was like beaten severely and it was very brutal, but it's a matter of that dynamic I was just speaking about, which is a more powerful, older teen, right? Or someone older that took advantage in a way that was, I think, more conniving in terms of outsmarting you, right? Because you're younger and you just don't know any better. And it's like kind of that looking back and realizing how much you were taken advantage of. It's kind of like you and I were in Italy once and we were at a restaurant. We got scammed, like totally scammed by the restaurant. We laughed, and then it was like the usual suspects thing where you start piecing together all the things at the end on the bulletin board and you're like, holy crap, they just took us for all our money. Then we went back and totally confronted them. So it's kind of like this thing where you're at a certain age in your life and then you look back and you're like, oh my God, this was so wrong and this happened. And then there's like this meltdown, right? So I feel like listeners wonder why it takes so long for people to come forward. And I feel like that's probably a big part of it. Because, I mean, think of yourself as a 16 or 20-year-old, right? How much were you really willing to deal with at that point in your life? Or you're so self-absorbed in the happenings of the now that you're not really addressing that. And that's, again, my personal experience.
Yeah, and it could also be evolutionarily that we've evolved to be able to disassociate ourselves from that something that's traumatic, to be able to survive it, and then it takes time to go back and reflect upon it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, because this is, again, it's like we talked about earlier. It's your personal experience that you went through that is valid, and you have to go through that process in the best way for you, and the best way that you're doing it for yourself, how it's working for you to go through this healing process is going to be different for someone else. But again, there are many resources out there, and there's also, I think, the importance of a conversation like this is to just remind people yet again that this is not uncommon, unfortunately, not uncommon, that you're not alone, and that there are things that you can do to start moving in the direction of healing.
Yeah, and another stat I wanted to just throw out there really quick is 1 in 3 adults would not believe a child if they disclose sexual abuse.
That's very sad. Because you think about children, um, and maybe they're not able to explain things correctly, but there aren't too many kids that just straight up lie, right? You know, I
I mean,
mean,
unless they talk about like the dragon they saw in the other room, or
yeah, but it's sort of like I don't know, the even that what they saw in the other room at Dragon, it could have been just like, well, the shadows formed, scales or something. So are they really lying? So um, again, we don't have children, but I in the same
we're
way,
around a lot of them though.
we're around a lot of them, and also it's a relationship. And what's the most important thing with a relationship is communication and trust. And I think I would hope that if we had a child, right, that we would have that same way we talk to each other, where there's communication, there's trust, that you would provide an environment where the child would feel free that no matter how bad the thing is, because here's the other thing from what I heard is um, when a child suffers this trauma, they feel guilty that they did something wrong. So then they're not able to go and tell a parent or an
Yeah.
older person this is what happened, because they feel that maybe they're going to get in trouble, that they're going to be judged, and so
Yeah, I mean, it's like how many kids go and admit they ate the cookie out of the cookie jar, right? Like you
that one
don't
time that I ate all
willingly
those
go and
cookies.
do it. But this is what I was looking for earlier. I just found it. It's the 73% of child victims do not tell anyone about the abuse for at least a year, 45% for 5 years, and some never disclose. So that just shows you like the accumulation of how many stories we're not like actually hearing. But you're right, because a big part of my healing process and continues to be is blame. Like, well, I didn't tell on him. I didn't say no. I didn't I took responsibility.
Yeah.
Right. So I took because I'm a teacher now and I'm all about extreme ownership, and I'm all about like, okay, if something doesn't go right, it's my fault. If something is going right, then good for everybody else. Like I'm always trying to take that ownership. And I think even as an adult, I take that on to myself. So it was very much that blaming yourself and feeling responsible because I was unable to disassociate who I am now to my 9-year-old self, and allow myself to protect my 9-year-old self, and realize I can't think back to what I would do then as who I am now, because that's not who I was then. And I was being manipulated by someone older. Right. It's kind of like you're just kind of out of your depth at that point when you're exposed to certain TV, or when you're hyper, wanting to belong, or whatever the reasons, right? Like whatever the reasons you come up with in your mind that all these things happen, or how you end up being a victim, it's you can't really ask those, but it's kind of like the biggest thing for, I think, women and men who go through this is that blame, and that I should have been able to protect myself, right? Because I think of who I am now, but I need to protect that child of then by allowing myself to feel and understand that it wasn't my fault.
Correct. And it wasn't your fault. And
sorry, listeners, I'm very emotional today.
Well, I mean, anytime the subject comes up, it's an emotional
thing. It is.
And I think that's part of it, right? It's the way that you have to. I don't know. I don't know if it's the way you have to or not, right? It just is what it is, and as someone looking from my side, I have to just look at it with no judgment and say, hey, this is just the way that it is. This, what happened to you should never have happened. Very sorry that happened to you, and it's not your fault. And then realize, hey, I'm here to support you in any way that I can, right? And I think back to, again, the car crash analogy. If you're a teenager and you crash your parents' car and then try to hide it from them, and didn't tell them, but then you ended up maybe with like a broken leg or something, all that parent would care is that you're okay. Like, they would totally forget about the accident. There wouldn't be, the blame wouldn't happen there. The first priority is, are you okay? And I think that's why that communication part is super important. Like where you said, if I can save one child from going through this, part of that process is that the parents need to be able to communicate to their children. You do realize that no matter what happens, no matter how bad anything were to happen, that you can always come to me, that we are here to protect you and save you, and we trust you, and all of those things. And you now could probably have a conversation like that with a younger person with your experience, years of therapy, being a teacher. But we have to realize that our parents' generation weren't equipped with those tools.
Correct. And
right.
I'm not,
And you're not. I'm not saying that you're blaming anyone.
Yeah.
I'm saying, but now there's more information, so it's almost like your duty to say this stuff to bring it to light, so that people realize, hey, this is, again, if you can help one person, then it'd be worth it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that I think was the most validating thing for me, was as soon as I released my life on the internet and I shared, was the positive response of, thank you, I'm gonna talk to my 5-year-old now, or I just had a conversation and it's one of many. And because I think it was really shocking for a lot of people.
Yes, definitely. Well, especially for people who know you, or even people who don't know you that well, who know the persona,
the persona
of Mimi Chan. But so, and maybe that's why it's even more powerful for people who listen to you and respect you to hear that coming from you, which is why it's
well, for the ones that believe me anyway.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, right? I mean, yeah. You think about it, there's people who think that the coronavirus is a hoax, right? So
exactly,
there's a percentage of people who don't believe facts, and that's just
I surprisingly don't really get as caught up on that as I could. It's hurtful, but I think it's again, all the work that I have for myself is for myself. The external factors of what other people think and all of those things have finally melted away. Most of my healing is all very, very personal and internalized. But I do think that learning about other people's experiences and sharing it is a super important part of life. And again, I really encourage anybody listening to always kind of be that open-minded when you hear a survivor story, or if you do have a young child, please educate them properly. There's no reason now, with science and all the amazing kid books I've seen that teach you about death and sex and the stuff that I don't even imagine I'd want to have conversations with kids about. Thank God, mostly I don't have to, because they're not our responsibility at that age. But I see a lot of great resources, and I will actually look some of those up and link them here in this podcast, because I'm not here talking today to just make everybody feel sorry for me or feel bad or feel uncomfortable. I do feel that nobody's going to go back to episode 5 or whatever episode and look up and go, hey, what happened back then? But I think that having these conversations that are relevant to now, I mean, when I wrote this, it was after the Me Too explosion had happened, and I actually had only shared with you, who I'm married to and have known since 1996, a little before that. So this is much, much in the latter part of my life that I was actually ready to deal with it. And I'm not going to get into I wish I had talked about it sooner bit, but my nature of just kind of wanting to always be purposeful. But I do think that sometimes coming back in and even you coming on air and kind of talking through it is healthy for listeners and for myself, to kind of be reminded that there's a lot of things to combat out there, and this is definitely still going on, especially with COVID and quarantine and children being stuck in homes that are abusive environments. And I have actually known of some, and it's horrifying and frustrating. And that is why, if there are people listening, to kind of just keep your eyes and ears open, because especially with this quarantine where people were home, that means people are stuck in the house with potential predators if that's who they live with, right?
Yeah. And even in thinking of vices, right? Of whatever the perpetrators' issues are, I can only assume would be exacerbated under a condition like of what we're going through now in
Absolutely.
2020,
Well,
where
stress, right? Stress
yeah,
causes.
what makes you revert to your your baser instincts, and unfortunately there's a lot of victims, and unfortunately there's the depravity knows no bounds, and and there's different levels of it all, but um like you said, you would hope that anyone who encounters someone who's open and trusting enough to come out with this to them, that you just are there listening to them with no judgment, with an open heart, and and let them express themselves. And yeah, it just sucks.
As a, for our listeners, I'll have Oscar kind of share with you, even because I often tell people that I know that, my mom, she's a breast cancer survivor, and of course we've known many survivors of in that, from that disease. And I often say, hey, people who are suffering from an ailment or disease, it's horrible. And then their immediate family or loved ones are really going through it with them. Sometimes we see spouses that look worse than the person
Yeah,
on
we've seen
chemo.
that. We've seen that.
We've seen people who are, you take all of that on as the caretaker, and being someone that has been a caretaker for a loved one, it is a lot. And so, as a caretaker of me, as somebody who, I would guess, it feels a little bit powerless, right? Like you can't go back in time and be protective. But as someone who is protective of me as your wife, as partner, as someone, I know most people are like, oh, you don't need protecting, blah blah blah, but it's not about that, right? But like, how is that for you in terms of being that support system?
I think an initial part of it is as a man. So it feels so weird saying that. As a man, baby, is your ego gets in the way first, just like everything else was like, well, I'm gonna do this stuff to some person, right?
Well, it's
But
like when our house got broken into, you immediately were like, oh, I hope they come back and I'll be ready.
yeah,
And,
which is
you just kind of have this, like, I'm guarding my
yeah,
home. I'm now here to be protective, right?
right. So, but then I have to realize that then that's me making it about me as opposed to making it about you. And so the only luckily, it's been a journey of a few years just for me of like meditating, and I kind of bring that up a lot because what the benefit to that is that you're able to recognize when you're having certain thoughts, and then you have the time and the awareness to say, is this what's the purpose of this thought? So that's the first step, is like, I think is realizing that it's not about you as the caretaker, quote unquote caretaker, like the person who is the who is in that strong relationship with the survivor. It's not about me, it's still about you. I think that's the first step. And then the other part is that when you care for someone, it sucks to see them suffer, no matter what that suffering is. um, it could be, burning your hand on the stove to reliving whatever the trauma was. It sucks. You're like, well, I don't want to see the person go through that. And yes, you do feel powerless because, like, it's not like I can heal you from this trauma, right? It's not like you bruised your leg and I'm Mr. Miyagi and I slap my hands together. I'm like, all right, I got this. Boom, that's it. And then you're like ready, right? It's still something that you have to go through. So the only thing I can say is, um, if you are the significant other or the loved one of someone who went through this, is just be there for them and try to just be open to having that person communicate whenever they're ready. I
Yeah,
guess. I don't know.
I think a really great thing that you, by nature, who you are as a person, but also we've been in a really long relationship for a long time. You know me very well, and I know you very well, but I think one of the things you really excel at is not trying to make too many suggestions and not being kind of pushy with like ideas of how I can be better or
Right.
what I need, and not also asking too many questions. Just usually if I have kind of a moment, like when I watched the gymnast documentary on the Dr.
Oh, geez, that was
Nasser thing,
horrible.
the court cases, I was probably not good for a whole day. I probably cried for about half of it. And it's about my empathy for them, of course. But I won't lie, it does become a rehashing and rekindling of a lot of thoughts that get into my head about my experience and the things that it's caused issues for throughout my life, right? It's not really just about the experiences I had. It's not about just about the abuses. It's about the suppression of it, not sharing, not being open, like always harboring the secret, always feeling ashamed. There's just so many layers, but I think that's why it still does affect me today. It's not like I can have one of these conversations and be completely fine. Sometimes I'm okay. I told Greg on the podcast a few weeks ago that, oh yeah, I've been wanting to get a little stronger so that I could help counsel others. And I don't know how I'm going to make it through counseling others when I can't keep it together from watching a documentary or even having this podcast. I can't keep it together the whole time necessarily, but I feel like maybe that's the Kung Fu training in me that says, okay, if I keep working at this, then I'll eventually get better. And I like to hope and think that that's how it is. But for me, for sure, with how your support works for me is that you pretty much goes, okay, what do you need me to do? And then sometimes you're just there passing me my tissues and
Or
and it's
just, I always say you can always cry in my shirts because we got a good washer dryer. So
right. Oscar's go-to in intense moments is comedic relief.
yeah, that's again, unfortunately, it's my own self-defense mechanism. But I've learned over the years to, yes, not try to fix something, but just to remind you that I'm there and what do you need. And sometimes you might need me to do something very specific, and sometimes they're like, no, just stay right there, sit still, and don't do anything. I'm like, all right. So when if you love someone, so you just whatever they need, you're just there, right? And
But I think it's like a lot of listeners are like, "Oh, what do you do as the friend or the so and so and this and this?" Because it's kind of like when someone passes away, you have your lines like, "I'm so sorry, they will be missed. Let me know what I can do for you." Like there's not a lot. There's like these things that make it very, and this particularly, it's not that it's worse, it's just that it's so awkward because it's so less talked about. Like everyone's probably been to a funeral. Everyone's probably had to say, you know, those words of sympathy and things like that, and I think this is really awkward for people, and my advice would be definitely base it on the individual and say, what their personality is. Sometimes they like ice cream, just give them an ice cream, or but really it's just, I'm here for you. And what I want listeners to take away from today also is just, I believe you. First of all, I believe you. And what do you need? How can I be there for you? And when you're ready, in whatever capacity. So, but I feel like that acknowledgement is really important for people, because you could even offer to help somebody out because they're in pain or whatnot. Even if you don't believe them, you just kind of want them to calm down or you want them to start crying. Or I think it's really important to acknowledge the I believe you, and then kind of go from there, because a big part of why people don't come forward is that fear
of not being believed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes
and
sense.
embarrassment. I mean,
Of course.
there's obviously so many reasons of who you are in society and how people will see you after that, or will it change, or and yeah, and definitely not being believed is huge.
And um, the possibility of damaging relationships, because when these things
Right.
happen, unfortunately, it's with people that you know and you grow up with sometimes, right? It's not
Yeah.
just
Well, I
it's
mean,
not
the
a
majority,
random
like we
not a
said from
random
stats, is
stranger,
family. Yeah.
right? So
And just on a brief thing before we jump back to that is that, when you think about your family hanging out and you're like, oh, that's okay because they're family, that's where you want to make sure you've had your good educational talks with kids of all ages. And if you don't know if other parents have had those same educational talks, then you need to be very aware of who you leave your children alone with. That's just the way that we have learned to have to be. Like, when I say alone, I mean, like, okay, you're gonna go for like several hours, or say, oh, you guys watch a movie, I'll be back, or like, I mean alone. It's not like in the house you have to be there every 30 seconds and hovering, um
yeah,
but
is it
you're right.
Not NASA's quote of trust but verify? There's something like that. It's like, yeah, when it comes to family, think trust but verify, and the verification is verify that you've had that open communication with your child, and verify the environment that you're allowing them to be in, even if it is your cousin or brother or sister.
Yeah, and I think, like what you were saying earlier with that, is that yes, you end up almost drawing this line in the sand, and it's really not about you versus them, right? It's more about, no, this is about me. It has
Mhm.
nothing to do with the other person. But people do draw a line in the sand and feel like it's a I take sides type of thing, and that's unfortunate, but that's human nature. Look at the
Yeah,
country we're in right now.
well, I think something that was commendable about how you approached it a couple of years ago was that you communicated to other family members saying, I won't judge you for you still having a relationship with this person. Um, I don't expect that from anyone. You just wanted to say this. You just wanted to tell your story. That's it.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard to do when it's something is so raw, because even if you say that deep down, I'm putting thoughts in your mind here. Even if you say that, you still want people to be like, damn it, that person, they were wrong. They're dead to me. I mean, obviously that was my thing, but
Well, here's the thing. I've known other people that have had this situation on both the survivor and victimizer side, right? On the abuser side. I've known people who say, well, so and so was 12 and so was 6 or whatever. And yes, it's horrific. We are also talking about a 12-year-old, right? And so, was there malicious intent? I don't know. I wasn't there. There could have been. There definitely could have been. There are some malicious 12-year-olds out there. But I mean, you always say, oh, look at those kids. Why are they acting like way? Well, they're acting how they were taught, right? And so you can't put 100% of blame on that 12-year-old. But that 12-year-old as an adult person who then takes responsibility for
and
it and
should
said,
reflect.
hey, this happened and I was sorry for it, and the person doesn't have to necessarily accept my apology, but I do know that I was wrong in those actions, right? Like, but again, think about a 6 and 12-year-old, because that's a very common dynamic from my understanding.
Well, I have a family member who, as an adult, I feel approached it the right way.
Yeah.
Which is, I did things at this age which are completely inappropriate, and I am okay with how that person has to deal with it. But I acknowledge the fault that I did.
Yeah, well, there's
And
accountability for your actions.
I'm accountable
versus
for those
denying
actions
that you did it.
And also, I am not that person now. Like, at that age range, what more can you ask for?
Yeah. I mean, which is, I think a lot of people wonder. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I've had some people wonder and ask or whatever. But I mean, I think that's the big difference is when you go and share your story, you're technically accusing someone, right? You're saying, hey, this happened. And then that other person has a choice of what they're going to say and do, And so, of course, in my instance, I'm sure listeners have figured out by now that, my accuser just decided to not take accountability and not remember the scenario.
Yeah, it's stuff that we've even done as adults, right? When you've been caught doing something, deny till you die, right? And
did you take the garbage out? I thought,
no, I did.
I don't remember.
And then all you have to do is just keep repeating.
Yeah, you can
your deniability,
believe your story.
And eventually
years
go by, and now that is the reality, and that's unfortunate, but it's just something that you have to. I guess you just have to recognize that that's what has happened, and you've already said it's not about that person.
Yeah,
it's about you and your process.
Exactly. It's really about me and what I'm going through, and as any survivor, it's about you and what you're going through. So for survivors, because I've talked a lot about people listening to survivors now, like for survivors, everything is on your time, and you have to take care of yourself, and you have to do what you need to do for yourself, and everybody's journey and everyone's situation is vastly different.
Yeah.
But I think people to understand me, right? So I want people to understand that I wouldn't necessarily also say, oh, well, no matter what, that 12-year-old who grows up to be 50 at one point, whatever, they're going to be forever a horrible person. Definitely not.
No.
There's a lot of people that have very much shown that they've made mistakes in their younger day, whether it's something as horrible as sexual abuse, or whether it's I did drugs, or whether it's
murder.
And they're not that person now. And I absolutely believe that maybe there's forgiveness, maybe there's even a relationship in the future, maybe there's so many different avenues, but there can't be if there's no accountability, or
yeah, maybe forgiveness is
regret for your actions.
Yeah, like maybe again, you don't even have to forgive that person. It just has to be more even an acknowledgement would be nice, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean,
but everyone deals with their thing in their own way.
Of course.
Until we walk in that person's shoes, then you have to look at it as, okay, this is what was done to you, and how are you?
Yeah, and that is definitely the approach that I've taken, which is more about my experience, my healing, how I can help others moving forward from either learning or through empathy, and just understanding that I have compassion, and that I am here, and I am always working towards being better and learning more, and that is a endless journey. So I think what I'll do is link a bunch of the things we talked about here. If anyone's interested in the blog post, the original one, there's all the statistics that we talked about, but this is a serious issue. It's something happening every day, every 8 minutes apparently, and I think that it's just a good time to talk about it. So thank you for having the conversation with me, Oscar.
Thank you, Mimi.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat, and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com, or follow me on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.